I was seriously dreading this day for a long time. The return of what's arguably the worst adaptation of a beloved author's work, and one of the most poorly written, pretentious, and dragged-out shows I've ever seen, the second season of The Rings of Power. To be honest, I was debating whether I should continue doing this little review series, since, according to Season 1's ratings, over 70% of audiences dropped out over the course of its run, which meant that the remaining 30 who actually got to the finale had to be complete masochists, or were embittered Tolkien fans like me who pushed ourselves to see that disaster through to the end so no one else had to. What else can be said about Rings of Power at this point that hasn't already been covered before? Well, I guess there's still the question of how much worse it could possibly get, especially when the showrunners themselves admitted they had already written most of Season 2 before the premiere of Season 1, and were too busy calling their critics patently evil instead of trying to take any of their insights to heart. I admit I was morbidly curious on that front, but what really drove me to make this video was to evaluate just how much this show fails at every idea it tries to push concerning their versions of Galadriel, Sauron, Elrond, Celebrimbor, and pretty much everything else they twisted in order to make Tolkien's lore more complex as they claim. Alright, if that's what they're going for, then that's how I'm going to judge them, as both an adaptation that's trying to stand apart from Tolkien's work and Peter Jackson's movies, as well as a new season in the most expensively produced show of all time, whose main goal is to now take all of the characters and conflicts they've established and give audiences compelling reasons why they should be invested in them going forward. That last part is what I believe every show should strive to accomplish in their second season, and don't worry, I've got plenty of examples to compare and contrast with how Rings of Power pulls that off. Several of them will be from the show I'm planning on doing a recommendation video for next, so you could call this a sneak preview for what I'll be doing in addition to these Rings of Power reviews, and even get a head start at watching a much better show than this. I'll be going over the broad strokes of what happens to each character across these 3 episodes, since just like the previous season, almost all of their plotlines are completely disconnected from one another, and don't progress all that much even in the collective span of a 3-hour runtime, which I personally found hilarious because the one change the creators kept boasting about was how this season was far more action-packed than the last one. As you're about to see, that's as big of an empty promise as J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay's promise of always going back to the book. Now, let's get into it. Episode 1 begins with a flashback showing Simpron and Adar addressing the last legion of orcs after Morgoth's defeat, where the former proclaims he's going to be the new Dark Lord so he can lead them all to conquer Middle-earth in order to save it from the very destruction they helped cause. As you can probably tell from that, and the fact that Simpron now looks like a hipster stoner straight off the Santa Monica Pier, we aren't dealing with very smart or intimidating villains, which becomes even more clear when he declares that many more orcs will die in his pursuit to gain power over flesh, and then goes on to brutalize the corpse of one rebellious orc, while the rest of them and Adar, the self-professed father of the orcs, watches him with barely contained anger. In a shocking turn of events that nobody could have seen coming, Adar stabs Simpron with his own coronation crown, and then gets the rest of the orcs to dogpile on him. I have to give some credit to the showrunners, in that I've never seen another story make its central villain a complete pushover who can't be taken seriously in less than 10 minutes. This is even more insulting compared to Sauron's depiction in the opening of Fellowship of the Ring, where all it took was Galadriel's narration and a well-edited montage to establish what a menacing, overbearing threat he was to all of Middle-earth. Meanwhile, all this gets across is how stupid and ineffectual the supposed new Dark Lord is, especially when the explosion his body lets out that ends up freezing the entire fortress like we saw at the beginning of Season 1 does nothing to Adar or the other orcs inside it beyond just knocking them over. I guess it was more important to have a cheap callback instead of establishing how powerful Simpron was before his change, and unfortunately, we're going to be in for a lot more cheap callbacks going forward. Anyway, Adar leaves with all of his orc children so they can go build their happy fun time paradise somewhere, while Simpron's blood has now devolved into the venom symbiote and curls up beneath the frozen fortress for an unspecified amount of time. Seriously, I have no idea whether 100 years or a single day has passed, because when it cuts back to the exact same shot, nothing's changed in the environment. The Simpron goo goes on to eat a rat and a millipede before stumbling out of the mountain, and then feasting on a woman who was unlucky enough to be passing by, so he can at last become Hallbrand. Rings of Power then brings out a familiar, yet no less aggravating hallmark of the first season by having him teleport hundreds of miles from the Ice Fortress all the way down to the Southlands. Because as you can clearly see, he's still wearing the exact same clothes with no sign of disrepair or even a little bit of dirt on them. You might think that's a petty criticism on my part, but I'm just saying, for a show that reportedly costs $1 billion and takes place in what is arguably the most sprawling, highly detailed fantasy world ever created, this only comes across as exceptionally lazy. Simpron then comes across a bunch of fleeing Southlanders and gets a warning from an old man that only death lies ahead. He responds with the oh-so-edgy rejoinder that he's just going to walk forward and embrace it, only for the old man to float a different idea by him.
I know you suffered. There's another life waiting for you. You just have to turn toward it.
Your family?
No. My family served them. Symbol of kings, long dead.
Then why wear it?
As a reminder that fortunes can turn for even the most powerful.
Okay, I guess Simpron wants to be good now. What? Don't you make life-altering decisions based on hollow platitudes given by total strangers? Especially after you walked across an entire continent with a completely different goal in mind? I've been cutting up this episode a lot up to this point, but believe me when I say I didn't cut out anything that gives context to this. Simpron goes from wanting to conquer the world and get revenge on the ones who betrayed him to deciding, yeah, I should go with these guys and turn a new leaf out of nowhere. So I have to ask, what was the point of even showing us his time as the Dark Lord when all he did was kill a mouthy orc and get cut to pieces before giving up on his plan almost entirely by taking the advice of some random guy he met by chance? It's also convenient that he happens to be the same guy carrying the pouch bearing the crest of the dead Southland kings, which ends up being the very thing he needs to convince Galadriel that he's the lost heir to the throne. I'd like to know where his clairvoyant powers were when Adar betrayed him, and it still doesn't explain how he thought he could fool anyone with this ploy, when all it took was a small bit of research for his entire story to come crumbling down. It's just a pathetic way to make Simpron look morally grey that couldn't be more at odds with who he was established to be at the beginning of this very episode with no proper justification. Sure, he ends up betraying the old man after he boards their ship and gets attacked by the water serpent we saw in episode 2, but as we see for most of that season, he was genuinely trying to live a peaceful life on Numenor until Galadriel pushed him to go back to Middle-earth so he could be the benevolent all-powerful dictator with his noble queen keeping him in check. Anyone who's seen season 1 or my reviews covering it already knows that none of this adds up, so all I'll say is that the showrunners still have no idea how foreshadowing or leaving subtle context clues actually works in a narrative. Ironically, this backstory dump only ends up making things even more confusing, since we still have no explanation as to why the Southlanders were in the middle of the ocean, since I highly doubt they were headed to Numenor with its anti-migrant policy on top of its anti-elf sentiment, and now that we know Simpron can't predict the future, there's no way he could have known he'd run into Galadriel and use the pouch to manipulate her. So in other words, the opening of this season is terribly written and should have been cut entirely because it failed to make Simpron sympathetic or menacing, and doesn't provide a believable context for any of his actions in both the previous season or this one so far. Yeah, not off to a good start, are we? We then pick up shortly after where his story ended in the first season, marching in to the newly formed Mordor. It turns out he's not there to regain control over the orcs or get his revenge on Adar, but instead to offer a ridiculous deal to him.
Let my people go, or yours will die.
My people defeated the men of these lands. We even defeated their allies. There is no one left for us to fear.
Since Galadriel's defeat, she sought out a new ally, to instruct the elves in forging a new weapon, a power that will allow him to use your children as slaves in his army once more. Set my people free and I will tell you where he can be found.
As much as I like the idea of Sauron manipulating somebody to go after himself, it all falls apart when you start asking why he did this. Simpron didn't gain anything by going to Adar, apart from getting Waldreg, the dirty barkeep from the first season, killed. In fact, all he's done is ensure Adar will prepare himself for war, which makes his goal of taking Mordor back from him harder than it had to be. It would be one thing if he went there with the goal of undermining Adar's rule by demonstrating to the orcs how he's not such a great leader, the same way Scorpius did with Captain Krace in Farscape.
Unacceptable. There are over 20,000 asteroids of sufficient size to block the Leviathan from our scans, sir.
I left orders not to be disturbed.
Of course, Captain, but I thought I might offer a course of action it seems you have not considered yet. If I was in command, Captain, bombard the area with multi-frequency signals. See if I couldn't make the offspring reveal itself in panic. And its mother along with it.
What are you doing here?
Admiring your quarters, Captain.
Quite opulent. Does displaying this decaying flesh remind you of past instances when you were powerful?
Your branch of the service gives you special privileges, Scorpius, which does not include disrespect of rank. I want you off my ship.
Of course you do. You have continually failed in all your duties, and I fear this ship will soon be in need of someone else to command her. My report to High Command sacrificed 18 of your elite crew in a pathetic quest for personal vengeance. It's all in there. You are unfit for duty by any measure. I personally intend to see you stripped of rank and office.
So you can take command of my carrier?
I already have.
Get off my ship!
Why must you force me to display my physical superiority to your kind as well?
If you want to fight anyone, attack your executioner.
But the difference is that Simpron didn't account for the fact that Adar could have just had him killed, thus exposing his supernatural nature and his true identity to them. It really says a lot when the guy in the full-body BDSM suit is the far more captivating and cunning villain, because despite having 1/10,000th of Rings of Power's production budget, Farscape utterly annihilates it on every storytelling front. Continuing on, Simpron returns to Lindon, where Cucabrimbor is still waiting to hear whether the rings he wasn't supposed to have made at this point actually worked, putting aside the fact he should have already guessed they had, since he was operating under a tight deadline in the last season, and so far nobody's come to tell them that the elves are leaving Middle-earth forever yet. This plot becomes even more insanely stupid when it's revealed that Galadriel didn't tell anybody his true identity.
If you do not leave willingly, you shall be removed by force.
She said you'd say that.
Galadriel, you have spoken with her.
Well, haven't you?
I have not.
You're not just a regular moron. You were designed to be a moron.
Hell, his best buddy Femwand didn't even tell him that he's not descended from the Southland Kings like he claimed, which makes what he and Galadriel are getting up to in their plotline even more nonsensical, but I'll get to that in due time. Even though Cucabrimbor should have every reason to not trust him and immediately throw him out, the writers instead chose to invent the perfect, contrived scenario for him to let Simpron in and begin manipulating him as Anatar, the great messenger of the Valar, come to help him save Middle-earth, even though he blatantly admitted he came from a force beyond evil. But I'm sure you don't need me to remind you how ungodly stupid everyone in this show is. At this rate, I would have to say Simpron's earned the gold crown in that department, considering all he did to make use of his godly shape-shifting abilities was give himself long hair and pointy ears, on top of the fact he couldn't be acting more like an unhinged serial killer. This entire plan is just idiotic on the face of it, since he couldn't have possibly known that all of the elves don't know he's Sauron yet, and all Shil-Galad and Galadriel did to counteract this was to send a couple of no-name red shirts with no armed escort to deliver a vague warning, which Simpron easily takes care of. More to the point, it makes no sense that there isn't any standing army protecting protecting a Region, especially when Galadriel and Femlond already know that Simplon's master plan involves forging these rings of power. I'm sure the showrunners didn't care about any of this, because they believed seeing Anatol at last would please all their naysayers, which is just pathetic on their part because this clearly wasn't planned from the beginning. The only way any of this worked out the way it did is because of plot contrivance, which also coincides with Celebrimbor not being informed on any of this, so Simplon can prey on his inferiority complex, even though he's already a legendary craftsman every elf respects without question. Honestly, it would have made more sense if he just hypnotized him to do this against his will, because yes, we do know Simplon is manipulating Celebrimbor, but he's doing it in such a clumsy, ill-conceived way that makes him look certifiably retarded for not realizing it.
Time is a luxury we lack. Supposing your High King were to discover...
Say what? Speak plain.
Your High King believes the dwarves to be unworthy of this power.
What business is it of his how I conduct myself in my own realm?
Celebrimbor.
No! I am congratulating the High King on the efficacy of the three and telling him that I'm closing up the forge.
You would lie to your High King?
I would grant us the space to complete our work. I have apprenticed, I have studied, I have reached the very height of my craft. Now, he will not take it away.
It's no secret that Jeff Bezos always wanted his own Game of Thrones for Amazon, which makes this scene and the ones in Numenor so hilarious, because it's obvious how desperate they are to emulate the kind of political intrigue that made its first few seasons so captivating, except all of the nuance and clever plotting amount to, hey, none of your friends appreciate you, so you should just blindly follow everything I tell you, even though you've caught me lying to you in the past, and somebody you trust already turned against me once they saw my true powers. But just don't worry about the fact I don't want anyone else coming here before you make those rings. If a character is stupid enough to believe that at face value without asking any deeper questions, then they deserve what's coming to them. Plain and simple. Oh, but don't worry, there's plenty of idiocy to go around in Rings of Power, especially with our good old pal Galadriel. Her story begins with chasing Femlond across Lindon, who's trying to bring the three rings to Shil-galad in order to convince him that they must be destroyed. This entire sequence raises so many questions that unfortunately never get addressed. Like, how did Femlond take the rings even when Galadriel seemed hell-bent on using them by season 1's finale? Why didn't he tell Celebrimbor something may be wrong with them if he's so desperate to destroy them before they can be used? And most bafflingly, how did he lose her even though she should know this land just as well as he does? Oh, it was all just a contrived setup so we could have this agonizing scene that further cements why Galadriel is one of the worst female characters ever written, and why anybody with half a brain should immediately lock her up for treason.
Elrond just informed me your companion, this Halbrand, was not who he claimed. Who is he?
He is not what I thought, which is the reason I did what I did.
As a matter of fact, it was my intention.
Companion is merely feeling the weight of his task. No doubt, come time, he will do his part.
Galadriel informed us.
I wondered how the Queen knew to lay me at her father's bedside. Never occurred to me you'd hand me over for a guild crest.
You used me.
Ever since you met this guy, you've been doing nothing but trying to force him to get what you want, and now you have the gall to accuse him of betraying you? You still have no solid confirmation that he's actually the king of the Southlands. So for all you know, you could be doing something you'll end up regretting for many years to come.
Why do you dance so to avoid revealing the truth?
Isolde. I was deceived.
No, Galadriel, you were blind.
And what frailty blinded you, Elrond?
Not Dinan.
What other path did your failure, Khazad-dûm, leave us with but this?
You were my friend!
Dinan!
You know, it's ironic how the writers deliberately butchered Galadriel's character to make her this empowered warrior figure that all feminists could rally behind, but all they've accomplished is making her a petulant, arrogant, and selfish brat who never takes responsibility for their mistakes, and is always quick to lash out at people whenever they stop doing what she wants. I can't imagine how any decent person could possibly be inspired by this, much less call it an improvement over the wise, ageless sorcerer that Cate Blanchett so brilliantly portrayed. What's most aggravating about this entire plotline is that the narrative is doing everything it can to not punish Galadriel for her actions. Oh, sure, Femrond and Gil-galad will chastise her in this moment, but just like with many other obnoxious girl bosses, that won't actually inspire her to not make those mistakes again, and are quickly swept aside so Gil-galad can order Femrond to hand over the rings, as he believes they're the only things that can save the dying great tree. Full disclosure, this is not how the 3 elven rings worked. True, they were created to stop the decay of elven domains, but it was due to the natural passage of time, not some funky black goo that popped up out of nowhere. Furthermore, the elven rings were made last specifically so Sauron couldn't corrupt them, since Galadriel and the other elven lords had already caught on to the fact that they couldn't trust Anatar. Not only is this scene comprised of dumb melodrama, but it's dumb melodrama that completely goes against Tolkien's lore and reduces several of the wisest and most powerful figures in Middle-earth into drooling morons. Thankfully, Femrond develops the first bit of common sense he's ever had in this entire show, and jumps off the waterfall with the rings. From there, he seeks out Círdan, the shipwright who's also one of the oldest and wisest elves, which you can tell because Rings of Power keeps reiterating that. Naturally, just like with everything else Rings of Power attempts to do, this Círdan couldn't be more of a simple-minded buffoon whose advice to Femrond amounts to, well, if you destroy the rings, we're all dead, but you do you, and agrees to dump them in the ocean for him while he holds off Galadriel and Gil-galad. Once again, Galadriel pretends to be Femrond's friend when she approaches him, only to make it clear that if he doesn't obey them, she'll just call in the elves outside to force him to comply. I'm sure you're wondering why Galadriel feels so strongly about using these rings, considering Femrond was the one trying to figure out a way to stop the corruption in Season 1, but it turns out it all comes down to her feelings. No, seriously.
We chose this path together, Eldil.
What so frightens you cannot consider the possibility of their corruption?
Because in my heart, I know the 3 rings are free of his influence.
Your heart? What good will that weak little thing do for you?
I don't need a weapon. My friends are my power.
Our letters to Celebrimbor have all gone unanswered. He refuses to send me without you.
And why is that?
You know the reason.
I'm asking if you know it.
Sauron used me, and under his hand I was played like a harp to a melody not of my choosing.
Sauron looked inside you and plucked the very song of your soul, note by note. You gave him everything he wanted and then thanked him for it. And now he has done the same to Gil-galad, and to every elf in Lindon.
I cannot let him in again. I cannot.
In choosing to wear those rings, you have all chosen to become his collaborators.
Yes, you heard that right. Galadriel, who successfully fought off the temptation of the almighty One Ring itself, has been reduced to nothing more than a simpering tool for Simplon's collection of ring pops. I know there are shills out there who'll insist that this makes her character more complex and vulnerable, that Rings of Power is just building her up to be the Galadriel we all know and love. To that, I have to ask, how long does it take for somebody who's lived as long as time has existed in Middle-earth itself to actually become who they're supposed to be? Or even just a person you can tolerate to be around at the very least? Well, it ends up not mattering, because Círdan ends up going full Gollum after screwing up his simple task, and then delivers the other 2 rings straight to Gil-galad and Galadriel. As expected, the tree is instantly healed, and everybody except Femrond pretty much disregards the fact that she's the one who brought back Simplon, and they could be playing right into his hands by using these rings. Círdan tries to brush that off at the beginning of episode 2, insisting that Femrond should only focus on all the good aspects about the rings, while also acknowledging that he and the other elves have already become lustful over their power. This is particularly ironic because Gandalf brings up a similar point in Fellowship of the Ring, where he refuses to take the ring from Frodo, because even though he would try to use its power for good, it would still end up corrupting him into a tyrant to force everyone else to do his bidding for the sake of the greater good. Meanwhile, the supposed wisest elf of them all, who also happens to give Gandalf that very same ring later on, barely seems troubled by that concept. I can't imagine anyone from Moya's crew viewing Zan as the wise voice of reason of their group if she spewed nonsense like this without providing any real meaningful insights, in spite of the many personal conflicts that she grapples with.
We do not yet fully understand these rings, but look at the power they exert over every form of life. But do not let that fear blind you to the ways it can be used for good.
You'll need to develop some patience yourself if you expect to survive here.
I'm trying. Aaron and Dargo, it's like everything's a test.
John, they're soldiers. Win their respect. Actions speak to them. Actions like tactical maneuvers, defending the ship, fixing the heat. Oh, I must say you handled yourself like quite a man of action today.
Yeah, I'm getting the hang of a few things. Of course, when I do...
Things change and you find you're more confused than you were before.
Yeah, pretty much.
Time and patience.
So, who lives and dies in your world is as arbitrary as it is in mine?
The answer is reverence for all living beings, which may come with
time and patience.
Yes, John. I get the feeling you're going to get the hang of things soon.
That right there is the big difference between good storytelling and inane scribbling from a pair of hacks who can't think of a more logical justification for Femrond to put aside his anger towards Galadriel so he can lead their incursion into Eregion, seeing as Celebrimbor has failed to respond to their half-assed warnings. Galadriel wants to lead the charge, but Gil-galad isn't having it because at least with Femrond, he doesn't have to worry about him going completely ring crazy or shooting moon eyes at the sworn enemy. Oh yes, this show is still trying to ship Galadriel and Sauron together, and from the looks of it, it's only going to become more pronounced going forward now that she's confirmed he's rooted in her mind. I wish I could say the Dwarven plot, the only part of Season 1 I had even the smallest interest in, could pick up the slack from all of this soap opera drama, but unfortunately, there's plenty of that to go around here as well. To cut a very tedious and melodramatic story short, the two Durins are still mad at each other over their disagreements about mining mithril, but after light shafts start closing all across Khazad Dûn and Celebrimbor offers them rings to solve the problem, they more or less make up, and he then hands over a tiny piece of mithril ore for them to make the 7 rings for the Dwarven Lords. This part cracked me up. Because if you recall from the previous season, Celebrimbor originally wanted to make a crown instead of rings, but they were forced to make do with the little ore they had. You would think he would bring up the idea of making crowns again now that he's got the dwarves fully on board, and thus all the mithril he could possibly ask for, but it never gets brought up because the writers only wanted to establish the nonsensical context for why the rings were made in the first place, and just left it at that. Also, I guess the Durins aren't concerned about disturbing the great evil in the mountain anymore, since neither of them bring it up, even though they teased the Balrog at the end of the last season. So basically, all of the drama between the two Durins about mining mithril turned out to be completely redundant. Don't pay attention to any of that though, because Durin the Fourth is now suspicious of Anatar.
We summoned you here to help you.
I'm sorry. Who exactly are you?
Yes, forgive me. This is a friend. The elves.
And where's Elrond?
Lindom's restoration demands his full attention. Herald Elrond said he could think of little else than helping his dwarven friends. He speaks of you so fondly.
He's never mentioned you, Lord.
Anatar.
Might we have a wee moment to mull it over?
I am
Certainly.
afraid.
Rudimentary creatures of blood and flesh, your extinction is inevitable.
I was thinking, whoever that Anatar is, he doesn't know Elrond from a hole in the ground.
How do you know?
Because Elrond would never say such nice things about me.
Normally, this would be where I would point out that none of the dwarves ever suspected Anatar or their rings, mainly because the 7 never affected them the same way the 9 did with men, but in this case, I can't say I blame Durin for noticing how transparently shady Anatar is acting. Seriously, did the showrunners tell him that he always had to look like he wants to make a skin suit out of everybody he talks to? We've gone so far off-field from the books that a made-up dwarven prince is more considerate and perceptive than the Lady of Light herself, who literally had the power to peer into people's minds. I guess if there's one thing I can compliment about this plotline, it's that Disa and Durin still have believable chemistry together, although, given what kind of person Disa was revealed to be in the last season, I have the strong suspicion she's pushing him to make up with his father so she can regain her royal title, and eventually use her position to force the other dwarven lords to bend to their will. Either that, or the writers just forgot about her previous characterization. Speaking of wishy-washy characterization, I might as well go over what's happening with Nori and Dan on their journey to Rune. Since the writers still want to play coy about whether he's actually Gandalf or not, I'll just stick with calling him Dan in the meantime. Anyway, Dan is still worried about not being able to control his powers, while Nori provides some basic moral support, and further evidence that the Harfoots are some of the most despicable creatures in all of Middle-earth.
Don't be so glum. I asked you to conjure up some food, and you did.
I lost control.
So you need to learn how not to lose control.
I can feel the legs and the throat.
That's the best part. They're dancing.
You disgust everyone.
Putting aside that nightmare fuel, I can at least say that this storyline is slightly more tolerable than the last season's, primarily because we're just following Nori and Poppy, who decided to abandon her role as Trailfinder and embark on this journey with them. Hey, if that means Marv is going to be leading the Harfoots to their doom, I'd be willing to give Rings of Power an entire point if they confirm that in the future. In all seriousness, this plotline isn't nearly as torturous to get through as before, or at least not yet, because the characters we're following aren't complete murderous savages who pretend to be good people despite all the heinous things they do to each other, and the shared banter is believable enough to establish why Dan cares for them as his friends, and doesn't want them to be hurt through using his magic. However, like with all semi-decent things about the Rings of Power, something nonsensical always comes along to ruin it, which is in the form of another wizard who shouldn't be here either, as he uses his Discount Saruman powers to bring back Feminem out of the flock of moths Dan reduced her to in the last season. Discount Saruman wants to stop Dan from reaching the stars he keeps dreaming about, which could lead to him unlocking his full potential as a wizard capable of challenging Simpron. So, he orders his Witch King of Angmar reject to capture him, which then leads to another dumb scene of them trying to track them down, while ripping off a far more tense sequence from the two towers. Oh, but you haven't seen anything yet, because this next part ranks as one of the most bafflingly stupid moments of the entire series. Dan, Nori, and Poppy are still trudging along the deserts of Rune before he collapses from heat exhaustion. Lucky for them, there just happens to be a well sitting here in the middle of nowhere, with nobody directly guarding it, even though it's the only source of water in this entire area. Sure, it has a bell attached to the rope, but as we see, nobody is stationed close enough to ensure that anyone couldn't just sabotage the pulley system to take as much water as they want undetected. Fortunately for the Easterlings, Nori and Poppy aren't nearly smart enough to do anything like that, and so this only serves to draw the Witch King of Angmar reject directly towards them.
Oh, we were just having a drink of water.
What makes you think a mortal could defeat an East-Star?
The East-Star will surrender to me. Because if he doesn't, I will slaughter the halflings he calls friends.
Neyanna Toliel.
Why isn't he stopping it? He
God, I'm almost positive the showrunners were congratulating themselves for inserting that action scene to break up all the monotonous walking and talking, because that was everyone's only issue with the Rings of Power, right? Never mind the fact that this only happened because the Witch King reject didn't follow his own plan, or how astronomically convenient it is that out of this entire desert, Dan collapsed right next to the one well with an alarm system that could draw in any nearby pursuers, but not before he could be revived and find the stick he's been dreaming about all this time, so he can cast a tornado to chase them off again, which also happens to blow away Nori and Poppy as well, so they can go off and do their own separate plotlines across this season, because that's the only purpose behind this action scene. At this point, you might as well just admit your characters are nothing more than brainless pawns who lack any kind of basic intelligence, but can always rely on hack storytelling to bail them out of any kind of trouble. Let's just get through the rest of this nonsense. Last and certainly least, we have the Numenor plotline to discuss, and dear god was it the worst out of these 3 episodes combined. Elendil and Tom Muriel are back in Numenor, mourning the king's death with everybody else, or at least he would be if Discount Hermione didn't throw Isildur's disappearance back in his face. Episode 3 made me see why the writers were keeping her on the bench all this time, because now that she has been given something crucial to do, it turns out we can all blame Numenor's ultimate downfall on her. Well, both her and Tom Muriel. Everyone blames her for how badly the invasion of the Southlands went, but never once does she try to explain that they had soundly defeated Adar's forces until the volcano erupted, or to warn them that Numenor is destined to be destroyed unless they regain the favor of the Valar. All she has to say to the people who lost their loved ones in the aftermath is that she understands their pain, and they should all blindly trust that she knows what she's doing, even though I wouldn't call Karl Marx Pharazôn a very charismatic or even all that clever character, since he makes it so obvious from their scene afterward that he wants to micromanage her once she's crowned queen. I was still more interested in following his perspective, because he's actually putting work into accomplishing his goal, rather than just standing around with no plan of action to offer in the meantime. Of course, he wouldn't have been able to depose her so effectively if Discount Hermione hadn't revealed that she had seen the Palantir and brought it before the Numenorian court to expose that she's an elf lover.
This elf stone is your queen!
Silence! Nor's true ruler would never place trust in an elvish artifact and destroy it.
No! We need it.
Hey Muriel, that eagle doesn't look all too enthused about Pharazôn. Why don't you step up and show the people that you're willing to take charge of a situation? Oh, she's just going to stand there and let the guy with clear nefarious motives take the crown from her. You know, if you're going through the trouble of drastically altering these characters from their literary counterparts, can you at least have her try to display some of the tough arrogance she had when she put Galadriel in prison that one time? Especially when the fate of her entire civilization is at stake? It almost makes me glad that the rest of this episode is focused on Isildur as he struggles to escape from baby Shelob. No, really, the writers confirmed themselves that that's Shelob, and he somehow managed to go from being trapped in a burning building to being strung up in a spider's nest for what must have been days, if not weeks. Don't worry about that, because here's another forced action scene. Wow, it sure is lucky that Shelob didn't crush his head just like that orc a few seconds ago. You might as well have just had him swatting at tiny cave spiders, since we already know he's going to survive this, and nothing stands a chance against Rings of Power plot armor, not even a fully erupting volcano. Honestly, I'm starting to think these characters realize that as well, considering we see Isildur almost drink stagnant water, and then blindly trust a wildling girl after she stabs him. Astrid here can't even be bothered to warn him about the obvious ambush he's walking into, but I guess they needed a more dramatic entrance for the new and improved Arondir.
My horse. I can't abandon him.
Settle your own affairs as seems you best. I have my own to attend to.
You might be wondering why he's so bitter all of a sudden. Well, it turns out Bronwyn died sometime off-screen due to her arrow wounds being from Morgul shafts, I assume, and the fact that the actress chose not to come back for season 2. Theo's still around, although he's somehow become even more petulant and annoying than before, which leads to him being nothing more than an angsty teen throughout the episode. I really can't stress just how much this part of the episode drags down the pacing, because while it may look like the characters are having meaningful conversations, it's all just melodrama that amounts to the same conclusion. For instance, we find out that Isildur's mother died because she drowned trying to save him when he was a child, so he just wants to do some nebulous things to make him feel better. That's the same case with Theo and Astrid as well, since they lost their mother and betrothed respectively, and so they both resolve to just stumble around until they feel better about it, I guess. It's all just a cheap way to elicit sympathy from the audience, which is even done with the orcs themselves, as one of them begs Adar not to go to war so he can protect his family. Every real Tolkien fan has already been pointing out online that the orcs have always been inherently evil creatures who mainly exist to spread death and destruction as per Morgoth's will, so instead of reiterating that, I think it's more constructive to show an example of how to write a twisted, cannibalistic character to be sympathetic without using such cheap tricks.
Emily!
Have to eat, John.
You're gonna devour our bones if you get the chance?
These people brought my ancestors to this asteroid for a purpose. To rid it of all herbivorous life forms.
Bernie's kind must have known that your people would eventually decimate the food supply.
They expected us to do their dirty work for them and be long dead by now. In the end, we only had each other. But I also know, after I satisfy myself on your bones and those of your friends and finally Bernie, I will eventually starve to death anyway.
So what did you have in mind?
Bernie knows where my kind lives. Make him tell you. And then take me there.
You have got to be kidding me, right?
I won't hurt you. I promise.
I cannot guarantee the same for you if you move towards me.
I used all my remaining calcium to present myself in this way.
Why?
So... You listen. You must take me with you. Oh, give me food!
I'm sorry.
Please. Please, anything. Anything.
Emily.
Starvation.
Zan, we have to find a way to take her with us somehow.
No, not unless you're willing to sacrifice your shipmates one at a time. Dargo told me there were others coming, called peacekeepers. I will try to hold on until then.
We have bones. Bernie.
There is much cruelty in the universe.
Yeah, we seem to have a treasure map to it.
My point is, it's just an excuse for everyone to have trauma to make them seem complex, even though they don't do anything that demonstrates they're trying to learn or overcome it, which only makes Isildur in particular less sympathetic than before, since he definitely wasn't making the most of his mother's sacrifice by dropping out of the Sea Guard. Not to mention, Elendil has every right to slap him for not realizing that Astrid is clearly one of the people branded by Adar, and he's too preoccupied getting into her bodice. I'd like to see the Tolkien quote that justifies these hacks inserting a hipster romance into a fantasy epic. All that happens next is Theo and Isildur going to rescue his horse from the wildlings, only for the group to be carried off by some unseen creature in the dark who also grabs Theo as well. I'm not sure I even want to call this a cliffhanger, since that would imply these 3 episodes have built any kind of tension or suspense that an average viewer would want to see any resolution for. That's what happens when your characters range from being boring planks of wood to thoroughly detestable sociopaths who don't realize how awful they truly are, and continue to make the same idiotic, self-serving decisions over and over again. So, in conclusion, these 3 episodes deserve nothing above a 2 out of 10. All the pretty visuals, expensive sets, and soothing music can't make up for the numerous shortcomings across Rings of Power's storytelling, and that's without factoring in how much it fails at being an adaptation of Tolkien's Second Age. The only improvements I can say there's been over Season 1 is that there are a few more action scenes breaking up all the monotonous melodrama, but it still doesn't change the fact that over 90% of the show is still monotonous melodrama, featuring either flat flat, underdeveloped, or thoroughly detestable characters who routinely make idiotic decisions despite supposedly being the wisest people in Middle-earth, barely learn from their mistakes if ever, have flat-out boring goals that the audience is barely given a reason to care about, and to top it off, are up against villains who are even less compelling than they are. The biggest issue with this entire show is that for all of the decent parts I can pick out of the sludge, each new episode always finds a way to undermine those few good aspects, like Durin's relationship with his father, people actually holding Galadriel accountable for her terrible behavior, or Dan's friendship with Nori, which ends up making the whole thing feel like a giant waste of time. Nobody would have regularly tuned into shows like BSG, Burn Notice, or Farscape if they pulled these kind of things with its characters and plotlines. Hence why those shows ran for several successful seasons, whereas I can't see how Rings of Power could ever have survived past one if it didn't have over $1 billion of Jeff Bezos' ego behind it. That's why I remain convinced that this show will only get worse the further along it goes, because it's clear the people behind it don't have the same kind of passion or dedication that went into making most of the best media of all time. So, all I have left to say is strap in, and remember that it's always worth making your voice heard. I'll see you in the next one. Oh, and just to be clear, my next big video is going to be about recommending Farscape. Trust me, it's a far better use of your time than watching trash like The Rings of Power. See you around.